All right. So we just finished project one, and we are continuing on to the next one, and it's going to be pretty fun. We're basically going to be making a tic-tac-toe game, but it's going to be like a live multiplayer game. So not just like you kind of give your computer, you hand it over to somebody to make their move. You can be on two separate computers and playing against each other and seeing your plays updated live as you're making your turns. So think of it as like, a multiplayer game that you played online, but a lot more basic because it's just tic-tac-toe. And I'm going to break this down into 3 milestones. The first one is basically building the simple 2-player live app. We're going to use 2 technologies that are new, React to build like a more complicated UI, and then Socket, which allows you to have those live updates of what the other player did. So you have real-time communication. Second milestone, we're then going to bring in like databases and persistence. So I want you to basically store how players have been doing as they've been playing on your app, and basically have a leaderboard of the rankings. So based on who's winning, losing, tying, you're going to be able to view a leaderboard that you store in your database. And then finally, this is probably the least exciting part, but you're going to add test coverage, improve code quality, and also do continuous deployment. So these are all things that are super important, and you end up having to do them at some point. So it's just good to go through that practice and think about things about how you want to test. I hope this sounds cool. Yeah, Elvis, that's good. I am going to get into the branches, but I do want you working on branches of this one. So you're thinking in the right way, actually, John. We do want 3 branches, 1 for each milestone. Yes. No, it's okay, Nikki. So what's different about this project? First thing, and I think some of you are picking up on this already, we are going to have a lot more increments. So, well, not a lot, but we have 3 milestones instead of 2 now. There's a lot more moving pieces. So instead of just your basic Flask server returning down HTML and CSS, we now have some communication using Socket. We're also connecting with a database on the back end. Our UI is being rendered on the client with React. So there's a lot more going on. So it's just going to be more complex. And then the last big one is we're going to be working a lot faster. So milestone 1 is due in 2 weeks. You had 3 weeks total to do project 1, but milestone 1 is going to be due in 2 weeks, and then milestone 2 and 3, you're only going to have a week each to do those. So you have to be moving really fast. You can't just do everything in the night before. You're going to be pretty screwed if you do that. You need to make sure that you're constantly working as we cover each topic. And I'm going to try to help you there by including a lot of project work in your assignments, and also make it relevant to what we do in class. You're going to have a lot less hand-holding because the specs are going to have less hints, less like approaches for how to do things. You're going to have to figure that out on your own. But the homework, again, is going to help you in these sorts of things. And then the incremental workflow with Git branches. So I am going to require that you do each milestone on a separate branch from main. And this is going to make grading a lot easier because we can then grade your milestone 1 branch while you're working on milestone 2 and get grades out faster. And you're also going to be forced to think of things in this incremental workflow with branching. And then you can obviously merge things into your main once you're ready to kind of showcase this later on to someone. And you're also going to need separate Heroku URLs for each milestone. So you're basically going to be pushing each branch to a separate Heroku. This also makes grading a lot easier because we can grade faster while you're working on the next milestones. And Mamoun, we're still using Python and Flask as the backend. Okay, so any thoughts, any questions about project 2? I've posted the link on Slack. I created a new channel that I'll add you to. and I will post the specs on Canvas as well, just so it's everywhere. 3 web apps, 1 for each milestone, and that final web app is going to be like your final project for project 2, or like final app. Okay, I'm excited. I think this is going to be really fun. There's a lot more interactivity in this app. It's not just displaying some static content, and games in general are just fun. So, all right, glad to hear, John. Cool. So now let's get to React. This is kind of the first new technology that you're going to need in Project 2 in order to build that sort of game UI. If you remember last time, I had briefly introduced like syntax with React and a little bit of background. I want to recap that syntax really quickly. So a component is kind of that building block or basic unit in React that you're coding up. And it's just a function, but it's kind of letting you split up your UI into different like independent reusable pieces. And you can kind of think of each one in isolation. I gave an example of a component here, your basic function syntax, and it's returning back some HTML, JSX type of thing. And then you can put like variables and logic and loops and if statements, all that sort of stuff directly inside of your component. But thinking in like terms of components, just kind of conceptually is really important because it'll help you figure out how to split up your code into these different like components when you're making them. So let's say that you have this kind of mock given by your designer. They want you to code this up for like a grocery store app, or I don't know, I guess in this case, it's like a, I don't know, a general store app of some sort. But what do you see here can be broken down into components? What do you think is like reusable, should kind of be thought about in isolation, and then kind of built together like building blocks to create this full UI? So look here, I see like a search bar. I see kind of sporting goods with different prices and like listings here. I see electronics. How do you think we could break this up, this large UI, into smaller pieces or smaller components? Give me some names or some examples from what you see here. Colton said search bar could be a component. Yeah, so the search bar is kind of, there's a lot of functionality there that you need to deal with. Like how do you type in stuff and like change things in the UI based on the search. So you could kind of encapsulate that in one component. That could make sense. Search bar, the button. Dominic said the sections, types of goods. Yeah, so you have sporting goods and you have electronics. They're kind of being displayed in a very similar way. You have your header, and then you have some listings underneath each one with the price. So there's some way where you could kind of reuse that UI, but just for different sections or like different types of goods. Gerard said, yeah, the button. So only show products in stock. That could be another functionality that you might want. What else? We could be even more granular here. The sidebar, maybe. Which sidebar? Each of the items for sale. So yeah, one of these, one of these. I'm seeing that you kind of have the name of the item and then the price of the item, and you're repeating this every time. The content might be different, sure, but in the end, you still have a very kind of basic UI that you're rendering that you could reuse. John, yeah, the component could be the department. So that's what somebody was saying, like the types of goods. I was kind of considering that too as the same thing. The black bar on the side, if it has any functionality. I don't actually see the black bar. Oh, I think it's just, yeah, sorry about that. It's just Google. No, you're good. You're good. All right. So here's kind of an example then from what we were saying. And you guys pretty much were talking about similar things. So, I mean, one, you're going to have the root component, which is just like this orange line here. You have to have some base, and then you kind of can put other components inside of it. And then you could have maybe the search bar, you could have all of your listings, and then you could maybe separate it out into like your department. Looks like they didn't do that here, but you could. And then here in the red, you see each item could also be a component where you have like the price and then the name. So always think about like how you can slowly make things more modular and smaller. And that's just going to be good React code. Okay, so get your Cloud9 out. We are going to start a demo just going through how to create components and render them and things like that. Glad to hear some people are happy the demos are back. All right, here we go. All right, so today we're going to start with our React code and build on it to make a to-do list. So you should have your React starter repository cloned and all the installations and stuff set up. So we're going to start by cding into our React starter directory in our Cloud9. And then to actually run this, so right now it's not running actually, you have to do python app.py in one terminal, and that's setting up your Flask side of things. And then you also have to create a new terminal, so you can use the plus button here, cd into your React starter directory again, and then do npm run start. So with our create React app skeleton right now, this is how we are going to run everything. And there's going to be a lot of benefits that you're going to see, such as the live editing in this sort of structure. So now you can go ahead, preview, and you should see the spinning React logo with your name somewhere if you did your homework 8. But let's just get rid of everything within the main file. So to go to your main file, you can go to source, src, and then app.js. This is kind of the file that you need to care about. There's a ton of stuff going on in this big repository, but this is kind of the root component where we start rendering all the stuff onto the page that we see. So you don't actually have to worry about the HTML file. That's kind of just a lot of skeleton code that's not really going to get touched. And you're just going to have this div, this empty div here with nothing inside of it, that all of your React code is then going to be rendered inside of. So basically, only worry about your app.js and then everything that is being created within this tree underneath app. And we're going to see what that looks like. So I want to start by in app.js, just delete all of this. We don't need any of that. And save. And you should see that everything disappears on your preview. Again, you're not going to need to refresh anymore because you have live editing. And how can we make sure that this is working? Let's just try typing in our name, and you should see it pop up right here. Perfect. So this here is kind of the most basic form of a React component. You're defining a function. You give the name of the function. In React components, we always start it with a capital letter. It can take in some sorts of arguments if you want. Right now, this doesn't. And then in the body of the function, you can do all sorts of logic and then finally return the elements that you want to actually display on the page. So here, it's just a div with some class, and you have some text inside of that div. But we want to do it kind of like a to-do list app, or maybe like just some sort of list where you can add some content in. So let's add that content. Let's start by just doing kind of a list element that we know about. And you would start that with unordered list, so the UL element. I'm going to put that on both sides. And then inside, you can put the LIs. So here I can put, let's say that we're doing music. I can put Travis Scott. I can put glass animals. And then I can put okay. And here you have a list showing up. And actually, this is kind of being centered automatically by probably the CSS. You can take out class name so that it's not centered anymore. Great. So you have a list. Let's say I want to add my favorites as the header. So we have a little bit of structure now, my favorites, and then some sort of list underneath. This is all super normal stuff. You should be expecting this from our past HTML work. It's nothing new. But now let's actually make things a little bit cooler. So components are all about breaking your UI down into smaller and smaller pieces. And those pieces are kind of they provide this hierarchy that allows you to build them together and make a larger and larger UI. So what are some pieces that we could break this down into right now? Well, one obvious thing is these list items all look the same. The only difference is the content actually. So let's try practicing making a new component for those list items specifically. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new file in my source. So you can right click, you can do new file. I'm just kind of lazy, so I'm not doing it in my terminal. And let's say we can call it list item.js because that's what it's going to look like. And then let's open that up. And we can always start by importing React, just in case you need some stuff from it. And then let's just make a component. So again, you're just creating a function. And right now we're going to start with no arguments, and then it has something in between. Now here, let's say I want to return what I was doing right here. So I keep repeating myself. Let's just choose one of these and then return that here. Okay. Okay. And then how can we actually call this component or use it in our root level? So how can we replace this with our component? You need to do two things. The first thing you need to do is export this function. This allows you to then access it from other files. And then in here, you see some examples here. You can import it. So you're going to put curly braces in between, and you might actually see some things populate on their own for how you can do that. And then in the actual kind of path, you can do // because you're in the same directory as your app.js file that you're calling it from. And you can do list item.js. And then we have list item. And if you cover here, then it says it's defined, but it's never used. And also it's missing a semicolon. So this kind of helps you figure out how to clean up your code with these sorts of warnings. So now that I have it, you're going to use the syntax very similar to when you create an element with just plain HTML, but it's actually going to be a JavaScript component. So let's replace this right here, this Travis Scott, with our list item. And we don't see anything changing because we're successfully just kind of returning the same list item element. Let's take all of these and actually just make them all list items as well. The code's looking a little bit cleaner now because you don't have to keep repeating yourself, which is nice. But then here you're seeing that Travis Scott is getting repeated every single time. Now, this is where something called props come in. So as I said, this is a function. Right now, these components are not taking in any arguments, but props are basically these arguments that you can pass down to the element you're calling or that you're creating and give it some information for what it's supposed to display. So here, let's say that I'm going to take in my props. So in list item, add props inside your function arguments. And props is like a special keyword that that's kind of telling React that these are these like special variables that your component is going to have access to. And then you can actually pass things into this props argument from your parent level component by passing in some things. So let's say the name of our prop we want it is just name. And then you can set the name equal to whatever value you want. So let's say we want Travis Scott in this one. Let's say in this one, we want glass animals. And then in this one, we want Ariana. And this here should remind you of the sort of syntax that you use when you define attributes for HTML elements. So something like that, if you had an image, then you could do source equals something. And the props are the exact same type of syntax. So I'm passing this in now, but when you save, you're not going to see anything change yet because you haven't actually taken the prop and rendered it inside of your component here. Now, to do that, this should remind you of your kind of Jinja work with Flask templates. You basically use these curly braces to reference some sort of variable in your JavaScript. So the variable could be something as simple as name here, my name, and then you could put name here, and you would see that everything changes accordingly to the value here. But we don't want some random variable. We want what is passed in our props. Props is an object. So you would basically do props dot and then access the key or like that key that you have set here in your props object. In this case, the key is name. So you would do props dot name. And this is how you're basically accessing some value of props. And there you go. Now you see that even though we're calling the same list item component 3 times, because we're passing in 3 different props, it's getting rendered differently. So this is how you can kind of take UI components that are meant to look the same, but have different data inside of them, maybe for whatever reason, and kind of make a way for you to reuse them across your code in order to have better code. And one thing I want to note at the end here is right now I'm just passing in one prop and it's a string, but you could pass in multiple props, so multiple arguments basically. They're all going to be within that props object though. So I'm typing this in the chat, but you could do something like this. So here in the chat, I have added 2 props. One is my name, which can be a string. And then the second one can be like a number, which you're going to put in curly braces, and that's your number. And then you could access them by either props.name or props.mynum. And then you can get more and more kind of fancy with that. So you can pass in arrays, you can pass in objects, which are like dictionaries. And yeah, so that is kind of the building block for components. Yeah, Nakib, so you can kind of think of it as custom HTML tags with JavaScript logic in them. So not plain HTML, you can have all sorts of code functions and things like that. Okay, any questions? Any other questions with what we're seeing here? And I'll put this all on YouTube. John, make sure that you have put the component in the right folder, in the right directory with the right name, all that sort of stuff. pretty fast, like too fast to keep up with, or it's working like fast in a good way? Okay. What's the export at the bottom for? So you can either put export before the function definition or export at the end, which is for the file. And this is basically, this lets you access that component from a different file, similar to like when you do imports in Python. But if you want to access that in a different file, you need to do export function, or at the bottom, export default, and then the function name. Can I go to list item.js? Yes. That everything changes. Oops. There you go. You're previewing from app.py. So you can just do like preview running application. That should work. Yep, Python app.py. Make sure just read through the React starter instructions and like follow that order, and everything should work. If all right, cool. Let's keep going then. And these are all going to be on YouTube, so you can more slowly look at them on your own too. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit more about how React is kind of working under the hood, and that'll help us understand some more complicated things we can do with it, like using state. So basically, what React is doing is it creates like a virtual DOM, kind of like a copy of the existing DOM, that it uses to see like how to make the best changes and updates to your UI without you needing to worry about it. So who can remind me like what is the DOM and what is it used for? Chat me or unmute. For storing data, what kind of data? Document object model to manipulate elements. What kind of structure is it? A tree, yeah, right? And exactly, Nakeeb. So it represents the elements on the web page, so like those HTML elements in a tree structure. And this makes it easier to kind of access different parts of the tree, different children, and make updates to them, which is kind of what you were doing when you do like get element by ID and stuff. But React is kind of handling a lot of this for you already, so you don't need to worry about like what components to update or like what elements to update and things like that. It's kind of just gonna keep track of what the DOM is, what you want to make it look like, and then how to change it. So there's a few kind of steps to like the life cycle of what a React component goes through. The first step is when you first kind of load it up and you're inserting these like HTML elements from the component into the DOM, then we call this mounting. So this is only going to happen once, and you're going to go through this phase where you kind of just take whatever elements you want for like this component and then insert it into the DOM. And then the next step is kind of like the render phase, and this can keep happening. And this is basically where those elements are updating based on some sort of data that's changing. So in that function component, we were basically going to rerun that function whenever anything like the props change from the arguments or internal state changes, which we're going to talk about. And this is kind of the stage where as kind of data is changing or like the user is interacting with the UI and you want stuff to change in your component, then it's going to be updating based on some props or state. And then kind of the end of the life cycle is what we call unmounting. So maybe we're like going to a new page, or just for whatever reason, we're no longer rendering that component anymore. When that happens, then we're basically removing those elements from the DOM. and that's on mounting. So 3 stages, just kind of always think in terms of like mounting, updating, and unmounting when you think about the life cycle. And one other thing to mention, actually, so usually when you talk about life cycle, you're going to see a lot of stuff related to class components. So actually, a lot of the React documentation on their website deals with class components, but we are only teaching you the functional version, and without giving like the class sort of the information around how to use the classes. I only want you to be using functional components in your projects, in your homework. If you use class components, then you're not going to get credit for the homework, and you're going to lose a lot of points on the project. So make sure that you're using functional. The reason for this is functional React is just basically the future of React development, and functional programming in general is kind of the future for JavaScript as well. One reason, like functions are just a lot easier to understand than classes. If I throw you a function and I show you like all the code for a class with the constructor and different methods and things like that, it's just going to take a little bit longer to pick up like and understand how those kind of work. And functions are also like a lot easier to test than classes. And functions in general can be like more efficient when you're using functional programming. So the reason that React is kind of moving from classes to functions is that it can optimize a lot of things better without needing like heavier data structures like a class. And this is where something called React hooks is going to come in. These are basically different helper functions that React provides, which allows you to not have to make a class component, but still have all the functionality. Yeah, exactly, Elvis. Once the functional kind of have these hooks that you can use, the classes are pretty much useless. So at Facebook now, you're not going to see class components much. We're kind of working hard to refactor all of the code so that there's no class components anymore. And in general, it's just good to, if that's the way you know how to do it, because that is what companies are all going to be striving towards and moving towards now in the future. All right. So there's kind of 2 sorts of variables that you're dealing with when you're doing React. One is what we talked about, the props. So these are passed in as arguments into your component. These are immutable, meaning your component, when it gets like an array or something as a prop, it shouldn't actually modify the value. You don't want to manipulate it in any form. You just want to directly use it in some way. And this is what we call like a pure function, pure functional component with pure variables. And there's a lot of reasons for this, kind of it's designed in this way, but the main thing that you want to know is that this can lead to bugs and like just confusing code if you're mutating things. Whenever you're updating, whenever you like want to create a different variable from your prop, then you create a new one. You don't make an update directly to it. And I'm going to talk about that when we do our demo. The next part is state, which is basically, it's not going to be passed in. This is something that's defined and maintained just within the scope of your component itself. So this is strictly private. Nobody else can access it. And your state is basically allowing you to store some information over the course or like the life cycle of a component. So maybe you're storing like a list in your state from what like the user is adding to like their to-do list. The state basically allows you to maintain that list as the user is slowly adding different items to it. And you can use that information to then update the UI. So the React component is basically automatically going to trigger an update to your UI if either the props change, so you're passing in a new value in a prop, or if the internal state changes. So whatever variables you're storing in your state, if those change. These are the only 2 ways that you should think about updating the UI that you're looking at. So if you want a button to change color, if you want the list to have a new item in it, you have to make sure either the props are changing or the state is changing. And then React is going to handle all the rest for you. So this is going to be super useful. You don't need to think about how um, how to like change the DOM and things like that when something happens. React kind of does it all for you as long as you're following their rules. So props changing or state changing. And now we are going to talk about in the demo how to use state. Glad you figured it out, John. Cool. Okay. All right, here we go. Okay, so far we've been doing very basic, very static kind of rendering of what we want to see on the web page. But if we're dealing with some sort of like interactive list where you can add more stuff to it, then we need to use more complicated and super useful React APIs. So let's start and think about what if we want the user to be able to basically type in something they want to add to the list and then submit that so we know we can add it to the list. What are some key elements that we need for that? Well, one is going to be the input, and hopefully you remember doing this in the last homework. So I'm going to define an input element. The type attribute is going to be text because they're putting in text. And then you're just going to have your closing tag. So if I save, you see this pop up here. And then once they've actually typed something in, we want them to be able to confirm that they want to now see that text in our list. So how would we do that? Let's add a button. And then we can just put some text in there, which is saying add to list. And now this is a pretty clear UI for how to add to the list. So now we're going to be dealing with a list that's kind of generated by the user instead of just these sorts of strings that we've been manually putting in. And the key thing here that lets us do this is what we call React's state. So React basically within each component, you're able to store some information and keep track of what we call state. And the state can keep updating over the course of the session, say as a user is adding more things to the list. So let's start by importing this hook that we call useState, which is allowing us to actually set this up. So you're going to do import in curly brackets, useState, and then from React. Now, to actually kind of set up this state, we're going to use the following syntax. So we're going to define a new variable with const. We can call it state in this case. And then we're going to make a call to this function, which is useState. And in that call, you're just going to pass in one argument, and that is basically your initial state value. So when this component is first rendered on the screen for the first time, which is kind of what we're saying mounting into the DOM, then it's going to start with some initial value that then we can change and make it kind of update as the user is interacting with your app. So anytime that the value of your state that you set up changes, this whole component is basically going to be re-rendered. So React is going to rerun this function with the new value of state based on how it's changed. So in my case, I just want an empty array as the initial value. That's kind of like an empty list. And slowly we can add all of the items that we're adding or that the user is adding each time. Now the useState function is returning a value that's actually an array. So we can do something called destructuring that array, and you can look this up. I'm not going to get into it right now, but it allows you to break up that array, or in a case of an object, into its kind of elements. So this array is going to have two values. The first value is going to be the actual state value. So what starts out as an array and eventually kind of builds on it. So we can call it my list. And then the second value that's returned in this array is basically a function that allows you to change the list to whatever you want. So these are kind of what is exposed by the use state. And this allows you to actually make things interactive now. But how can we actually do that? One thing I want to mention here. So remember that your state can be any type of any type, basically. So right now I'm choosing an array, but I could do a number, I could do a Boolean, I could do an object. And in your initial state, if it was like a number, maybe you would want to start with 0. Or if it was a Boolean, maybe you want to start with true or false. You can choose. So this here is just an example with an array. Remember that it can change, and also that you can have multiple state multiple state variables that you're maintaining in your code. So multiple lines of calling use state. And they're all going to return this sort of array object where you have the value of the state and then a function that lets you update that state. Well, let's start by first actually rendering the content that is being stored in my list onto our page so we can keep track of it and see how it's changing. There's a few ways you can do this. The easiest way is you can take a list and then use the map function. So my list, or this is an array, .map. And then in map, you're going to pass in a function actually, which is telling us how to take each element from that list and then return it as some other type of element based on like that initial original value. So I'm going to do my list.map, and then we're going to start with an argument in this function. We're going to call that item, and that's going to be each item that the user has added. So each kind of string in this list. And then what we want to do is return. And remember, you don't need to actually write return here. If it's a one line, it's kind of implicitly written into it. So I actually want to take each item in this list that I'm building slowly, and then return an actual list item component based on that information. So item is going to be a string that the user has kind of inputted and added. And then what I want to do is take my list item component and create a new one for each item where the name prop that we had set earlier is my item value. So if this list was basically Travis and Glass Animals and Ariana, then we would basically loop through each item in this list. We'd start with Travis, and then we would return a list item component, which would basically render this Travis right here, this kind of with a bullet in the HTML. And you see I'm using these curly braces around my map call here. So similar to how we were doing it in Jinja, where we would kind of add those curly braces whenever we would want to use some sort of Python logic, like if statements, for loops, things like that. So similarly to that, in React, if you want to kind of add any sort of one-line JavaScript logic, such as Boolean statements and things like that, then you would need to have those curly braces there, and you can put stuff in there. Map, in order to render a list of stuff, is probably one of the most common use cases here. Okay, so we have something dynamic going, but we haven't really done more with it. But before that, let's just remove the static stuff that we've been doing. So I only want to see what the user's actually adding. And right now we're going to start with nothing, which makes sense because we have an empty list. We haven't made any change to it yet. So nothing's actually going to be rendered. If I started here with Travis Scott as my initial value, and then I saved, then you would see it show up here. So we know that we're successfully rendering this list now that's in our state. So now how do we actually make a change to this state value based on what the user has done? Well, to do that, if you remember in our JavaScript homework, we were basically adding what we called event listeners, which are listening for some like click event or something like that, and and running some logic whenever that event happens. So we're doing something really similar here. What we're going to do is in our button element, once somebody's typed something in and clicked the button, we can run some function. So the button in React is going to have an onClick property. And then here you can set it to some function. So you could do it inline or you could do it separately. I'm going to do it separately just for readability. So you can define functions inside of functions. That's totally okay. I'm going to define this function called onClickButton. And then it's not going to take in any arguments. And then it's going to run some logic. Now I can take this name, so this is my variable name, and I can pass it in here into onClick. So now the button knows that whenever the user clicks, we're going to run some code right here. Now that code we want to run is basically we want to take our state and then add some text in based on what the user had put in. So let's start by just updating the state in general. I don't care what the user's text was. In order to do that, remember we have this helper function that was provided by our useState call. So you could actually do change list, and then you could have the array that you wanted. So let's think about how we want to do this. One thing you could do is, let's say that I have my list, and then I want to append something on. So new item added. Dot push is basically dot append that you have seen in Python. So I've added it there. And then let's change the list. This is basically going to just take in one argument, which is the new value that we want. So let's say now that we have kind of added the element, we want to change the state value so it has this new list again with the push thing. So let's try that. What we would expect here is that once the user types in something here and then clicks the button, then this string here should be added to my list, and then you should see it rendered here by the list. So when I try this out, I type something in here and I click add to list. Nothing actually happens here. And this is actually expected because we've changed our state in the wrong way. So we only added to our existing state value, which was just kind of this empty array. But React is only going to update when you provide it a new value. So we have to create an entirely new list, not just add to something, in order to trigger the update in the UI. So in order to do that, you can use some fancy syntax, but I'm going to create a variable called new list. And then I'm basically going to take an array. I'm going to use something called the spread operator. So 3 dots, and put in the value of the operator, or put in the value of the array that I basically want to break up and add into this array. And then also add in my new item. So basically this is a fancy way of creating a new list with your item appended instead of just saying something.push. And this is what we call an immutable change, because we're not mutating or changing the original value of my list. We're creating a new copy of that array and then adding the value to that new copy. So now let's try passing in new list into our function right here, which should update the state and actually show up in the UI. So I'm going to refresh, and then I'm going to type something in. And what we would expect is every time I click add to list, a new item should be added. So I clicked it, new item added, and here you can see the UI is automatically updating whenever you've changed your state. So this is cool. One thing actually, which is a better practice beyond that, is in change list, you're going to have access to an argument called the previous state. So I can call it previous list. And this is saying whatever the value of list was when you're making the call, I'm going to take that, and then you can just run your code on there. So I want to basically destructure previous list with the spread operator. And then I'm creating this new array copy and adding my item here. So the only difference is that I can do this directly within my change list call and have access to whatever the previous value was instead of choosing it here like so in my list. So this would be the better way to do it. So let's try refreshing. And then here you can see that it keeps getting added whenever we make the change. All right, so final step is we right now are just adding some static content. We're not actually adding what the user wants to put in their input. So how can we do that? Well, if you remember in JavaScript, we were doing something with like document.getElementById. You'd have the ID, and then with that element, you could do .value in order to see what the value or like whatever text was in this input was. In React, there's an easier way to do it. You can use something called refs. So there is a hook or like kind of this function that you can use called useRef. And that basically allows you to have access to everything in this input element, similar to getElementById. So I'm going to call this my input ref. And then I'm going to just pass in my initial value of null. So right now, I haven't set anything to ref when this function is initially called because I haven't gone later into my code where I actually create my input element. But then what we can do is set the ref attribute here to my input ref that I set there. So you can read more about why this works and how this works on your own time. So here, once I've set the ref, now I should be able to access something from within this element, like the value of the text. So I'm going to call this user text, and I'm going to be creating this variable inside of my function because I want to get the value every time that the button is clicked. And what I can do is input ref dot current, which is just saying whatever the reference is currently looking at, and then the value. So this is the actual value of the input text that I want. And then you can actually pass in user text instead of creating a static string when you're adding to your state array. So I'm going to save this here. And now what you should expect is based on what the user actually types in here, when you click add to list, then we're grabbing that current value and then rendering it here. So that's awesome. And then I can type in other things, and this will slowly get added more and more and more. Great. And the cool thing here is that you don't need to, each time that something is clicked, you don't need to basically run separate functions or anything. You're giving all the rules to React, and it's automatically updating for you whenever something changes. And one other thing I want to mention here. So you see when I clicked the button, then Glass Animals gets added to the list. But Travis Scott and Ariana Grande, they don't go away from the list. So that means that your state variable, which was my list in this case, that's actually being stored through the entire life cycle of the component while it's on your screen, which means that it's not going to get like refreshed or anything. Even though it's re-rendering, it's going to have access to what the state was before and then what the state is now. So that allows you to basically slowly build on something and store and remember this information over the whole life of the component. Okay, any questions so far? or this was the second demo, how to use state, but how was this? What are some confusions that you guys have with this? Yeah, Nakib. So there's a lot of source code there. You can read about how Create React App works and like what the point is of all these files. But basically, what you need to like worry about is just your JS components like app.js and everything that it's rendering. Um, a lot of times like this shouldn't slow it down too much because you're going to have something called Webpack, which bundles everything together into like a single file, and that can kind of optimize things. And obviously we have like a lot of add-ons and things that we're using here, but these are kind of like a standard that you're going to see used across like a lot of React apps, and you're not going to really feel any performance hits with this amount of stuff. Ronak, so user text, we define that in line 11, which is just grabbing whatever is currently inside of that input, whatever the user has typed in. And then in line 12, we're actually adding it to our state. So we're changing our state variable to have a new array with the user text appended at the end. What else? What are some other things confusing you guys? I'm sure that's okay if there is a lot because this is a lot of new information you're taking at once. Yeah, Kadeem. So the spread, that dot dot dot, is basically just unpacking everything that array into your new array. And if I didn't have the user text after that, then I would basically just be making a copy of the array because I'm taking my array, unpacking everything into a new array, and not adding anything. So the spread itself doesn't do anything to add. It's just an easy way to kind of give the old elements at the beginning and then just define something at the end. And these are like weird syntaxes that you're kind of just going to get used to over time. Just Google like how to do something immutably, and you're going to see on Stack Overflow like the best ways to do that, and you can read about those. Google how to make like updates, immutable updates to your variables. So how to immutably update an array or how to immutably update an object. This is actually in part of your homework, so you'll see that there. Mm-hmm. What else? React is something that kind of it's going to take it's not just going to click immediately in a day. It's a different way of thinking than you might have been used to, where you kind of just go in order and execute code in a certain order. Here you're kind of defining rules that go in an order, but they're going to be constantly rerun. That same function is going to be rerun. Natham, which part makes it so that the same string doesn't get added twice? There's no part that's actually making that happen. If you see here, we have an onClick function. When you click the button, you're only going to run that function once. And then you're only changing the list once. So you're only calling change list, which updates your state one time. So there is some place where you're either you're either calling the function twice or you're appending something twice. Yeah, so if I added the same name, it would show up twice. Right now, there's no check to make sure that there's no duplicates. Yeah. Okay, nice, John. Good to hear. All right. Cool. So React, I think, is super cool. Like I'm a front end nerd. I like front end technologies and working with them. And React is kind of what I use on the daily at Facebook. And more companies now are using React whenever they want like more complicated UI. And the live editing is awesome. So hopefully that makes like all of this boilerplate code that you're downloading worth the better developer experience. So from what you've seen so far, what advantages do you all see between React and the sort of like vanilla way where you're just using plain JavaScript and HTML to make something interactive? So think about homework 8 and what you had to do in order to add new articles to your page and things like that. Nikki, you said, so it's easier to break up UI into smaller pieces because it's defined in terms of components and functions, then it's a lot easier to make that like modular code instead of like one huge JavaScript file that you need to organize yourself. And Elvis, yeah, I think it is on JavaScript. So you're using plain old JavaScript here, and there's not too many like other APIs that are specific to React that you need to use. So it's pretty simple in that sense. And yeah, so you can focus on like what the end result of the UI is, but you don't need to worry about like how to manage the DOM and like append a child and get your element by its ID and things like that. And yeah, John, so React is a library or framework in Java that's built in JavaScript. So you're writing JavaScript code still. You're just using certain functions and APIs that React is giving to you. Yeah, so there's kind of this concept of like an imperative versus a declarative API. Before React, like in the old way of doing things, and this is probably the way that you've also like kind of used just in like all of the code that you've run in the past. Usually your programming is imperative. This basically means you're kind of following a certain step-by-step order of how to execute code. And that can include like manually going and finding like an element in the DOM, storing that in a variable, and then like kind of manually replacing or appending children, things like that. React is different in the sense that it's abstracting all of this DOM updating away from you. And in its API, you're kind of just, you're declaring like what you want to see at the end, like what the end goal is. And you're not really saying like the step-by-step about how to actually go about that. So you don't need to worry about like finding the element, making the update and things like that. You're just telling React, here's my props, here's my state variables, and here is how I want to combine those to show my UI. If those variables change, then it's on you to figure out how to make the updates so I see changes. And this can be, this is just going to make your life a lot easier as a developer. Technically, you can do it the manual way, and maybe this could be faster or something, but React has a lot of good algorithms that kind of allow the updating to be pretty efficient on its own. And another way of thinking about like declarative versus imperative, imagine that the end result that you want is like, I want to give you instructions on how to make a painting, how to draw a certain painting, maybe of like a mountain, a river, like a forest, things like that. In the old way of doing things, like imperatively, that painting, the instructions I would give would be like, slowly like draw a line from the bottom of the canvas going upwards, and then draw a line going downwards in order to make the mountain. And then draw like squiggly lines to make water for the stream, things like that. Declarative is different, and you're kind of just giving the instructions of, I want to see a mountain, I want to see a river here, I want to see a forest here, and then you kind of figure out the steps inside of there to get to that end result. So you're not going through that step by step, line by line, how to actually do all of it. And this is a discussion you'll probably see across other programming languages, libraries, things like that. This is just one example of that difference. Yeah. Okay, so there's actually no time right now to do homework 9, but the homework is basically going to be to create some simple React components that are the building blocks for your project 2. So I'm already going to force you to start on this early because I know that the deadlines are tight. And you're going to use state in order to create a basic tic-tac-toe board where when you click on different things, then the like the X or the O pops up on in the correct cell. So hopefully it's just a little step beyond what we've covered today in our demos. Homework 9 will be posted to Canvas right after class. I think I actually forgot to publish it, so I'll do that. And it's okay if you're still confused. I think it took me a while to figure out how to use React and really understand like what's going on. The only advice I can give here is basically just like read through as many examples as you can, and slowly things are going to start clicking. So I provide 3 links here, some documentation from React, and also this YouTube video, which kind of goes through an example. They're all really good and helpful and should give you more context. So don't rely on this lecture on its own in order to give you all the information you need to do the homework and just use React in the right way. So homework 9 will be due next class by Thursday afternoon. And yeah, that's it. Let me know if you have questions, office hours, Slack, you have all the right channels. And also start reading the project 2 specs because it's going to be due in 2 weeks. I posted them on Slack, and you will also see it on Canvas and other places. And then next class, we're going to talk about how to use Socket for this sort of like live updating and real-time communication for our online game. And I'll stay back for 10 minutes if you guys have any questions. John, you can stay after too. But that's it. Have a good rest of the week, guys. Good luck on the homework. Good luck with React, and I will see you Thursday. See ya. Bye, Nikki. Bye, Venkat. Bye, Philip.
Hey, Professor, do you mind showing the JS that you had at the beginning of the class? Remember that I asked you?
Yeah, I'll pull that up. You were asking that, remember?
Yeah, when we started the class.
Yeah. All right, I'll do that. Bye, everyone. See you, Karel. Bye, Elijah. Bye, Jim. Oh, yeah, the reference links that I was talking about are in these slides here. Janice. Bye, Elvis.
Professor?
Yeah?
Yeah, I still can't get into Cloud9, so wait, I'm most likely gonna have to delete it.
Oh, no. I'm sorry about that, Julio. All right.
I could pull the program back out from Heroku, right?
Sorry?
Try to get the codes out of Heroku. That's my version 6, my final version.
Your final version, you can get it out of Heroku, you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there should be a way to access that code from there.
If that's the case, most of my stuff is already in GitHub, so it's not that bad.
Okay, that's good.
Also, is there a way to do Python without using a virtual stuff?
Without using what?
I forgot what they call it. Virtual machine.
Without using not on Cloud9, do you mean? Or
Like on Cloud9, but like when you code, you don't need to do that extra step. I always have to do every single time to source it to a specific folder.
I'm a little confused by what you mean.
I will show you explain later. I have a quiz in a couple minutes.
Okay, no worries. Yeah.
Okay, so Professor, so that's the event listener. So when you get the click, Then you're getting the input from the element ID from your HTML.
Uh-huh. Yeah, right here.
Oh, then you get the topic because I didn't. I was so you changed it, and you're on this one. You changed the topic, right? When
Yeah, so actually you don't need to do that in the homework.
No, I know, but I'm saying yeah, because that's actually something I didn't do, but I was confused, so I didn't do it.
Yeah, yeah. If you want to change like at the top where it's like what's being reported about this. Yeah. But yeah, what else? Was there other things you wanted to clarify here?